Welcome to Food for Thought. My name is Patrick-Goudreau. I'm your host. You can learn more about who I am and what I do by visiting my website, joyfulvegan.com. This episode is brought to you by the listeners of this podcast, and that means you can keep this podcast going and you can keep it ad-free by showing your support. You can become a patron at patreon.com/ColleenPatrick-Goudreau. You can just go to joyfulvegan.com and find the donate button. And you can also just click on the links in the show notes below. Just choose the level that's right for you. Also, if you're a listener on Apple Podcasts, you can now become a subscriber there, get bonus episodes and early access to episodes. Thank you in advance for keeping this podcast going, for keeping it ad-free. I appreciate you immensely. And speaking of support, thanks to everyone who stepped up to save the 30-day vegan challenge by purchasing copies. If you listened to that episode, in the end, we saved probably about 1,000 copies. About 1,000 copies will be in people's hands, which is what we want. About 1,000 copies or more are going to be recycled by the publisher, unfortunately. So if you are interested, you can still reach out to me if you want to buy about 100 copies at a time. You're just paying for the shipping. I can give you a quote. So just reach out to me if you're interested. Now, I recorded this intro recently, but I recorded this episode months ago. And as it is right now, I am leaving for Alsace, France, very shortly because we are running our third trip to Alsace, Joyful Vegan Alsace. I can't wait to see everyone who's joining us. We have many, many repeat travelers. This is the last call also for the Joyful Vegan Northern Italy trip. We're this close to confirming it. We really are. We really are this close to confirming it. So if you want to join me in Northern Italy, it's not 100% it's going to happen until you book your spot and join us. This is for June 2024. Same with Rwanda. There are spots left. We would love to confirm these trips and we'd love to have you join us. So go to joyfulvegantrips.com. Also, sorry for the delay in last week's episode. I am a new aunt because my sister, who is older than I am, and I say that because she didn't just have a child, but she has adopted 2 children. And I'm a new aunt for that reason. And I was in Florida taking care of my father. My sister and I are both working on making sure my dad has what he needs. He's still at home. We have a caregiver for him. He's in hospice, but he's actually improving and doing well. He's turning 92 in January, and we're just working on everything we need to make sure he's well taken care of. And so I was there for that. And I was also spending time with my new nieces, but I also have 2 nephews and 1 other niece, also my sister's children. So my sister adopted her first child from Russia 20 years ago, and then she and her husband had 2 biological children. And then now fast forward, she's divorced, but still very close with her ex. And she, as a single mom, single business owner, just adopted 2 girls from Colombia, 16 and 11. So it's been really fun kind of reinvigorating that aunt instinct that I love. So we cooked together and we spent time laughing and dancing and playing games. So that was really fun. And it was a really special way to kind of go into the holidays, which I'm really looking forward to. And speaking of which, one of the reasons I scheduled this episode for this time is because I wanted to time it so it was released near Hanukkah. The content, of course, is perennial, but I wanted to release it near Hanukkah because we will be talking about some Hanukkah foods. I love food history. The series I did on Italian cuisine was very popular. It received a very enthusiastic response from all of you. And I've decided to make food history part of the rotation for next year's episodes. I already do that kind of organically, but I am going to be making it a formal rotation, a formal topic in the rotation. It's baked in now, no pun intended. It's baked into Food for Thought. So send in your suggestions if you have other cultures, countries, food history you're interested in, and we can see if we can get that in the queue. So let's get on to today's episode. I hope you enjoy it and let me know what you think. Hi, everyone. Today we are talking about Jewish cuisine, Jewish food. Now, I'm going to ask for a qualifier here. I'm going to ask that you please be kind and you please be compassionate. I am not a food historian. I am a student of history. I'm a very curious person. I'm very interested in food, very interested in history. And so this is a topic I'm very interested in. And yet, in this case, and in frankly all cases, I'm an outsider looking in, right? I'm not Jewish. I am Italian, but I grew up Irish in an Irish household. I did not grow up in an Italian household. I did not grow up in Italy. So in the end, I am an outsider looking in, but my intention is always to represent the history and the culture from an objective, but also an affectionate perspective. Jewish cuisine, in this case, like the Italian cuisine episodes we did before, has been a part of my entire life. I grew up in New York and New Jersey. I grew up in New Jersey. I lived in a town with a very high Jewish population. You might remember me saying in the Passover episode I did that according to surveys, Livingston, one of the towns I grew up in, that was one of the places I was in from 15 years old until I moved to California about 20, what was I, 24? Livingston has one of the highest percentages of Jews in any American town. So the point is, Jewish cuisine is part of my experience, even if it's not part of my DNA. And I will do my best to represent it in an accurate and hopefully relatable way, because I think a lot of us eat Jewish cuisine. We just don't call it that. We don't put everything in a box, but I'm hoping to expand your understanding of and deepen your understanding of this particular cuisine. On that note, also please be kind when it comes to my pronunciation of dishes or words. My background, my relationships are such that I tend toward the Yiddish pronunciation rather than the Hebrew pronunciation. And I'm sure I'm going to pronounce things wrong by someone's account. So thank you in advance for your understanding. Always very happy to get corrections, but please do so with kindness and understanding. Now, you might remember in the Italian cuisine series, if you didn't listen to that, I really encourage you to go back to it. We did 4 episodes, one on Southern Italian cuisine, one on Central Italian cuisine, one on Tuscan cuisine, which is part of Central Italian cuisine, but I pulled it out because I just wanted to talk about Tuscan cuisine separately, and one on Northern Italian cuisine. So there's a lot to say about the diversity of Italian cuisine. And in a way, it's almost problematic to say Italian cuisine, right? Is Italian cuisine vegan friendly? Is Italian cuisine meat heavy? Well, it depends on what part of Italy you're talking about, because there's so much diversity and complexity related to this cuisine. It's not monolithic. While there's some overlap, of course, there's overlap because now it's a unified nation, but Italy was not a unified nation until the late 1800s. So there's a lot of diversity. There's a lot of differences between all of these different regions. Now, those differences, as we talked about, have to do with climate, topography, trade, neighbors, history, geopolitics, economics, all of it. Well, so too with saying Jewish cuisine. It's almost problematic to say that because Jewish communities are incredibly diverse with various cultural and geographical and historical backgrounds. There really isn't a singular Jewish cuisine, but rather a multitude of regional and cultural variations is the way to think about it. So I'm going to be making some generalizations, right? Even though generalizations can overlook this diversity, that's not my intention. My intention is not to overlook that diversity, right? The diversity that's due to the regional, cultural, historical influences within Jewish communities. However, we can talk about a Jewish cuisine in the sense that it serves as a unifying element. It contributes to a sense of cultural identity and connection. That's one of the powers of food. So we can talk about Jewish cuisine, and we're going to talk about why, what threads run through what we call Jewish cuisine. Now, finally, I'm not talking about Israeli cuisine or what is really more accurately and inclusively called Middle Eastern cuisine, the foods from a diverse range of countries, from Lebanon and Israel and Iran and Iraq and Syria and Jordan and Palestine, Egypt, Yemen, all of it, right? Also very diverse. We're going to cover that in a separate episode. But because of migration, i.e., the diaspora, the Jewish diaspora, these cuisines are reflected in Jewish cuisine. These various cuisines are reflected in what we call Jewish cuisine, regardless of where Jewish communities now live. Now, more on that in a bit, but the point is today we're focusing on Jewish cuisine, and there's a lot to talk about. So how are we going to organize it? Number one, we're going to talk about what foods are traditional Jewish foods, especially which ones are vegan, or veganizable. We're going to talk about holiday foods. We're going to talk about the cuisine that is intertwined with religious observances and holidays. We're going to talk about the special dishes that are prepared for the Shabbat, the Sabbath. We're going to talk about the special dishes that are prepared for various Jewish festivals, some of which we already talked about in the Passover episode. So I'm not going to be covering Passover. I'm not going to be covering the symbolic foods of Passover. Please go listen to that episode if you're interested in that. But we are going to talk about other festivals, other holidays, and other observances and what foods play a role in them. We're going to talk about Jewish dietary laws, known as kashrut. They obviously play a significant role in shaping Jewish cuisine, and that's one of the threads that certainly runs through it. We're going to talk about what that means. We're going to talk about how Jewish cuisine has been shaped by the cultural and regional environments in which Jewish communities lived. This includes Middle Eastern, as I talked about already, also Eastern European, also Mediterranean, North African, and so on. We'll get into that. Now, related to that, we're also going to talk about how Jewish cuisine tends to be categorized into Ashkenazi and Sephardic and even Mizrahi cuisines, communities, practices, etc. So we're going to talk about what the difference is, especially between Ashkenazic and Sephardic cuisine. And finally, I mentioned a little earlier, this is a vegan podcast, obviously. I'm a vegan cookbook author. I'm a vegan advocate. I'm a vegan recipe creator. So we're going to talk about if and how vegan-friendly Jewish cuisine is, or which types of Jewish cuisine is, and which are not. I mean, I'm mostly going to focus on which are. So we're going to talk about that. And I said, like in the Italian cuisine episodes, like if you want to go find episodes that are about Jewish cuisine that are meat heavy and dairy heavy and egg heavy, I'm sure you can find plenty of books and blog posts and podcast episodes or podcasts about that. I'm not here to talk about that. I'm going to talk about and emphasize which Jewish dishes are vegan, veganizable, vegan friendly, etc. So we'll get into that as well. So here we are. So much to say about this topic. So sit back. I hope you're sipping some hot cocoa. You can find a recipe for hot cocoa and hot chocolate in The Joy of Vegan Baking. Actually, I mentioned that I was timing this episode to be released around the same time as Hanukkah and the winter holidays. I do have a recipe bundle of Hanukkah recipes. If you are interested, we're going to be talking about some of the dishes today that are part of Hanukkah that are also in that bundle. So you can go to joyfulvegan.com, click on recipe bundle or cooking classes or whatever in the menu, and you can go find the bundles for, frankly, Passover, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and also Hanukkah. Many more to come, but it takes a lot to make these bundles, and they're not exactly bestsellers. So I can't just do them without knowing that they're going to be consumed by you. So go check out the Hanukkah recipe bundle, and I hope you enjoy it. Okay, so Jewish cuisine, characterized by a rich tapestry of flavors, a rich tapestry of ingredients and cooking techniques, influenced by the dietary laws we mentioned, kashrut, influenced by the culinary traditions found in Jewish religious texts. Whether you're a practicing Jew or not, whether you're Orthodox, whether you're conservative, whether you're Reformed, whether you're secular, doesn't matter. This food, this cuisine, is influenced by these culinary traditions found in Jewish religious texts. And so Jewish cuisine is this dynamic and evolving tradition that reflects the diversity and the adaptability of Jewish communities throughout history. It certainly reflects the resilience of these communities. It's a fusion of ancient culinary practices, religious guidelines, and the influences of the places where Jewish communities lived. And while every world cuisine is impacted by topography and climate and wealth or poverty and trade, what makes Jewish cuisine unique is the movement, the dispersal of Jewish people to the different climates, to the different topographies, to the different economic realities of the places they went to, right? Now, you will hear me use the term Jewish diaspora a few times throughout this episode, and understanding what it is central to understanding what Jewish cuisine is. You can't talk about Jewish cuisine without talking about the diaspora. So generally speaking, a diaspora refers to the dispersion or the scattering of a population with a common origin, often due to historical events, due to migration, due to forced displacement. The term is commonly used to describe the movement of a particular ethnic or religious group away from their ancestral homeland, resulting in the establishment of communities in various locations around the world. Diasporas can be caused by a range of factors. It could be persecution, conflict, war, economic reasons, a search for better opportunities, a variety of reasons. And typically, when members of the diaspora settle in new regions, they often maintain some connection to their cultural or religious or ethnic identity, which contributes to the diversity of the communities they join. So they're not only impacted by the communities they join, they impact the communities they join. Okay, so a notable diaspora, of course, would be the African diaspora, which resulted from the forced migration of Africans, especially West Africans, during the transatlantic slave trade. And the Jewish diaspora is one of the most well-known examples of a diaspora. It refers to the dispersion of Jewish communities from their ancestral homeland, which is traditionally associated with the geographical area that includes present-day Israel, parts of the Palestinian territories, as well as portions of Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, depending on the historical periods. So the scattering of Jewish populations began in antiquity, continued throughout history, continuing today, leading to the establishment of diverse Jewish communities around the world. The Jewish diaspora has been shaped by historical events, war, forced migrations, persecutions, and voluntary migrations as well for economic or cultural reasons. And it's for this reason that Jewish food is difficult to define because it's influenced by the foods in the many countries where Jews have lived or emigrated to. So Jews have eaten many different types of foods, often no different than those of their Gentile, their non-Jewish neighbors, and we're going to talk about some of those. But no doubt, the foods Jews have eaten bear the stamp of the unique migratory patterns of the Jewish community, while also reflecting and shaped by the Jewish dietary laws, the kashrut, and Jewish festivals and holidays and traditions centered around the Shabbat, the Sabbath, right? So we can use the term Jewish food broadly and narrowly. Broadly, in that Jewish food, Jewish cuisine, means a lot more than just what I think a lot of Americans, specifically those in the United States, North Americans in the United States, associate what is considered Ashkenazic fare, Ashkenazic Jewish cuisine, right? That's typically what we think of, bagels and cream cheese and matzo ball soup and that kind of thing. We're going to talk about those details, but it's so much broader than that. It's so much more than that, and we're going to explore that. But we can also use the term narrowly in that there are specific criteria as to what defines a food as Jewish, as a Jewish cuisine, right? So first, we have foods that are uniquely Jewish. A prime example is matzah, right? Not a lot of non-Jews eat matzah for pleasure. I actually really like matzah, but most people don't buy matzah on a regular basis. It's often purchased by Jews during Passover, right? Generally speaking, right? So that's one example of a food that is uniquely Jewish. A second category of Jewish foods would be those that adhere to the traditional laws of kashrut. We'll talk briefly about that. The foods that are deemed permissible to eat according to these food laws. And then lastly, there are foods that aren't specific to the Jewish community. They're not distinctly different, in their Jewish versions, but they're foods that we strongly associate with Jewish cuisine, that we strongly associate with Jews. I think a perfect example of that would be bagels, would be deli sandwiches, would be pastrami on rye. Again, growing up in New York and New Jersey, this was very typical. We ate all of that, but it was kind of in the back of our minds, like, oh, this is this is a Jewish cuisine. So associations, that's another um, element of how we can define what Jewish cuisine is. So let's talk about Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Mizrahi Jewish cuisine, right? So we can kind of divide the Jewish cuisine of the diaspora into essentially three main branches. There are others. This is a generalization, but you have the food of the Sephardi, you have the food of the Ashkenazi, and you have the food of the Mizrahi. So the term Sephardi, refers to Jews of the Iberian Peninsula. That's Spain and Portugal, essentially. Now remember, when we're talking about these historical periods when Jews were migrating, especially in the ancient world and even in some parts of the medieval world, there wasn't Spain as we know it and Portugal as we know it, but it's the region there, the Iberian Peninsula, parts of the Mediterranean, parts of North Africa, and parts of the Middle East. So that's the Sephardic Jewish tradition. Then you have Ashkenazi. Ashkenazic refers to the Jews of Central and Northern Europe, particularly Germany, Poland, Russia, but also France and other parts of Eastern Europe. And then you have the Mizrahi, which refers to Jews from the Middle East and North Africa also, but countries like Iraq and Iran and Yemen and Syria, Morocco, etc. So the overlap in the Sephardic and Mizrahi cuisine. But in the interest of time, I am going to be covering mostly Sephardic and Ashkenazic, but because there's also overlap with the Mizrahi and Middle Eastern cuisine, I want to talk more about that when we get to that episode. So there are a lot of other Jewish communities around the world who are not Ashkenazi, nor Sephardi, nor Mizrahi. So I just want to acknowledge that. For example, we talked about this very briefly in the episode on Central Italian cuisine. We talked about the Jews who lived in Italy before, at least before the first century BC, before the Sephardim arrived, long before either of the medieval European hubs began. So they're basically Roman Jews. They're called the Italkim, right? So the Roman Jews. So there are communities outside of the ones that I'm really focusing on today. But in the interest of time, we're going to just focus on the Sephardim and the Ashkenazi Jews. So just to finish, the dish that we talked about was the Jewish artichokes in the Central Italian cuisine episode. They are a traditional Roman Jewish dish. And they're deep fried artichokes, basically. They're delicious. You can get them in Rome today, but they're part of what would be considered the traditional Roman Jewish cuisine. So that's an example of that. So please do not scorn me for implying that these diverse Jewish communities can be encompassed by 2 or 3 categories. I'm very aware of the diversity of Jewish people. And if I'm not representing you, please forgive me. I'm doing my best. So I'm most likely leaving out huge swaths of people. It's not my intention. I'm trying to make this as interesting and inclusive, especially for people who've never really thought about it and never really sat down and drew the threads among the different Jewish communities. Whole books are written on this topic. If you want to support this episode and, I don't know, support a book on this topic or support more episodes on this topic, certainly become a supporter. That will certainly support me in doing the research and taking the time to produce an episode like this. So please feel free to support any of that. Okay, so let's start with the Sephardim. So there's the adjective, Sephardic. You have the nouns, Sephardi, which is singular, and Sephardim, which is plural. Now, this word, Sephardic, Sephardim, Sephardi, they're derived from the Hebrew word Sepharad, which refers to Spain. So that's why it's called Sephardic, because of Spain, the Iberian Peninsula I mentioned. So Jews migrated to Spain at various points in history for a range of reasons, including those economic opportunities and because of relative religious tolerance under certain rulers in this region and the desire for a safe haven from persecution in other regions. So we know that Jews likely settled in the Iberian Peninsula during the Roman period, but one of the most significant periods of Jewish migration to what we now call Spain occurred during Islamic rule, which lasted from the 8th century to the 15th century, and this was considered the golden age of Spanish Jewry. So much of Spain was under Islamic rule following the Umayyad conquest in 711. So we know right down to the date when they conquered this region, 711, and under this Islamic rule, Jews and Christians and Muslims were recognized as people of the book. They enjoyed protected status. They were able to participate in various aspects of society, including commerce and science and philosophy and the arts. And all of this was because there was a relatively high degree of religious tolerance and coexistence among Jews and Christians and Muslims during this period under this rule, allowing for the flourishing of cultural and culinary exchanges and collaborations in various fields. Now, this golden age came to an end. We also have the date for this. I said 15th century, but we can be even more specific. Unfortunately, it came to an end with the Christian Reconquista and the establishment of the Spanish Inquisition that led to the expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492. Shortly thereafter, from Portugal. And following this, many Jews from Spain, from Portugal, joined Jewish communities already existing in Italy. So I mentioned that they were already there, in the first century, right? In the Netherlands, in England, and in parts of the New World. So you had this massive expulsion of Sephardic Jews from the Iberian Peninsula and spreading out to these other regions. But having been influenced by Spanish, Mediterranean, North African, Middle Eastern culinary traditions, right? You've got this cuisine we can call Sephardic Jewish cuisine. It tends to be lighter, tends to be healthier, tends to be more colorful because we're talking about Middle Eastern and Mediterranean culinary tradition. So you've got this cuisine characterized by access to fresh vegetables, fruits, spices, olive oil, right? And in this way, I would say that Sephardic Jewish cuisine is very vegan friendly, right? And where there are animal products, many traditional Sephardic dishes can be adapted to vegan versions by just replacing the animal products with plant-based ingredients. Now, you're going to be familiar with most of these dishes. You're going to be familiar with them because you're familiar with the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern dishes. And like I said, this is an example where, you wouldn't say hummus is, a quintessential Jewish dish. You would say it's a Middle Eastern dish, but of course it is a dish that we can say is also part of Sephardic Jewish cuisine. So the same goes for baba ganoush, same goes for tabbouleh, same goes for falafel, same goes for couscous, right? So Moroccan, you've got this North African influence, lentils, right? Stuffed grape leaves, same thing. You wouldn't call it only a Jewish food because it's outside of Jewish cuisine as well. However, it would be embraced as part of Jewish cuisine. Dolmas, as you would know, muhammara, we've talked about, which is one of my favorite spreads in the world. And you've got some incredible soups and stews, and certainly lentil soups, lentil stews made with either brown or red lentils. And you've got something like a shakshuka, which is wonderful. If you've never had shakshuka, I highly recommend going to find some recipes for it. It's a spicy tomato and bell pepper stew. It's often served with poached eggs, but you can make it without. I had a couple who we've become very good friends with who adopted two cats I fostered. When we went over to their house for dinner for the first time, they made us shakshuka, which was absolutely wonderful. And they're not vegan, but they made it vegan for us. And yeah, you don't need the egg in it, but it's absolutely delicious, really healthy, really nutrient dense, very easy to make. And you can find lots of recipes online. So where a shakshuka would be a soup that we would consider a Middle Eastern soup or a North African soup, there is a soup I want to talk about that would be part of Sephardic, but it's also part of Ashkenazi. We'll talk about it. That does fall under this category of a soup that is connected to the Jewish Sabbath, and so we can talk about it as a Jewish soup. So there's a couple different names for it, and again, forgive my pronunciations here, and there's different names for it depending on whether it's kind of has Sephardic roots or Ashkenazi roots, and that would be dafina, also called adafina, or it could be called cholent or cholent, or it could be called chamin or chaman. And it's a traditional slow cooked Jewish stew made with probably meat, but we're just going to leave out the meat, and that is very easy to do, made also with beans and vegetables and spices and a grain. Now, so again, this really depends on the region we're talking about. So if we're talking about Central Asia, we're going to be talking about rice. If we're talking about the soup being made in North Africa, we're going to use couscous, right? Wheat. If we're talking about Europe, then it would be barley. So it really depends on where you are. It depends on the grain that you use. And even the potatoes, don't forget, potatoes are a New World food. So, they didn't come to Europe until the end of the 15th century. So it would have been made with other vegetables prior to that. And again, the beans also depend on what region you're in. But the idea is that this dish is typically prepared on Friday before the Sabbath. Remember, the Sabbath is on Saturday. And the dish is prepared on Friday and slow cooked overnight because it allows observant Jewish families to enjoy a hot meal without violating the prohibition of cooking on the Sabbath. And so that's the idea behind it. You would slow cook it the night before and then enjoy it the next day. So lots of familiar and delicious dishes there in the Sephardic category. Of course, there's overlap with Middle Eastern and North African cuisine, and obviously a lot of overlap with non-Jews, but it really is the Ashkenazi cuisine that I think many people would think of when they think of quote unquote Jewish cuisine. So whereas the word Sephardic refers to Spain, the term Ashkenazi is derived from the Hebrew word Ashkenaz, which refers to the medieval Jewish name applied to essentially the Rhineland in Western Germany, as well as the border region that straddled northeastern France. That's where we're going, right? So Alsace, Lorraine, Champagne. So many Ashkenazi Jews settled in urban centers. They engaged in trade, they engaged in finance and skilled crafts. They became an integral part of the economic and cultural life in medieval European commerce and trade and communities. However, it could probably be said that historically Sephardic Jews have been more integrated into the local non-Jewish culture than Ashkenazic Jews. In the Christian lands where Ashkenazic Judaism flourished, there was more tension between Christians and Jews in this area that I'm talking about in Western Germany and the Rhineland, in this area in northeastern France, right? So it tended to be that Jews were more isolated from their non-Jewish neighbors, either voluntarily or or involuntarily. And in the end, the Ashkenazi Jews developed a distinct language, and that language is known as Yiddish. It's a fusion of Hebrew and various German dialects. And if you're a longtime listener, we've talked about Yiddish in the past, not only in the Passover episode. I think that's the one where I talked about words, Yiddish words that actually are etymologies, but also because many, many years ago, I read a number of short stories by Isaac Bashevis Singer. So Singer was a Polish-born Jewish American writer. He was a Nobel laureate in literature. He came from a family of rabbis and teachers. He grew up in a Yiddish-speaking household, and he emigrated to the United States from Poland in 1935. He did it because he was escaping the rise of the Nazis in Germany. He is known for his prolific contributions to Yiddish literature, particularly novels and some short stories, some of which I read. And the reason I read them on this podcast is because, I used to read short stories on this podcast that were related to animals, animal protection, kind of our perception of other animals. And Singer has some incredibly powerful works about the relationship between the ritual slaughterer and the animals who were being killed. And Singer did eventually stop eating animals off and on for the most part, but his stories are just incredibly powerful. And I will probably reference them again when we talk about ritual slaughter, which is going to be an entirely different episode. We're not going to cover it when we talk about its relationship to kashrut. We're going to talk about it in a different context. But anyway, you would have heard me talk about Yiddish in the context of talking about Singer. So Yiddish served as a common language for Ashkenazi Jews, Jewish communities in Europe. And that Yiddish language, which many people think of as the international language of Judaism, really is the language of the Ashkenazic Jews. Sephardic Jews do also have their own international language. It's not as well known, and that would be Ladino. And that was based on Spanish and Hebrew in the same way that Yiddish was based on German and Hebrew. So if we're going to make a generalization about Ashkenazi cuisine, we can say that it reflects the migration of a community first based in Germany that ultimately spread eastward to Russia and to Poland. And so you also have a community that was poorer than their Sephardic counterparts, right, in Spain. You have milder foods, like just milder in terms of spices. So again, if you're thinking of the Sephardic, the North African, the Spanish, they have access to the Middle Eastern and North African spices. So that's a lot spicier. The olive oil, a lot more vegetables, again, because of the climate. But you have the foods in Russia and Poland and Germany. You're talking about a Russian winter. You need like heavy food, rib sticking cuisine, foods that are warming, foods that are going to keep you warm and full. So potatoes, and again, that came later, but potatoes, noodles, certainly meat, preserved foods, pickled foods. That's what marks a lot of this Ashkenazi cuisine, this food of Eastern Europe, right? And so again, this kind of cuisine that we think of when we think of Jewish food, the bagels, the knishes, the borscht, right? So that's what you can think of when you think of Ashkenazi food. Not all meat, but you can definitely see the difference here in the cuisine versus the Sephardic cuisine. And these are the dishes that you will be familiar with, and you can see the Eastern European influence in them. So let's talk about some of them. We're going to talk about some of the symbolism, right, and the significance of them. And we're going to talk about which ones can or are already vegan, can be made vegan, veganizable, etc. So the first one is this classic soup you've all heard of, would be matzo ball soup, right? And typically it's not vegan because typically it would be made with chicken broth. And you would typically use chicken's eggs in the making of the balls, but it can very much be made vegan. There are plenty of recipes out there. I have a recipe for matzo ball soup in both my Passover and my Hanukkah bundle. There are a couple crossover recipes for both, but you'll definitely find it in the Passover and you'll definitely find it in the Hanukkah bundle, the recipe bundle. And this is an example of a symbolic Jewish food, right? First of all, it's matzah, which is a quintessential Jewish food. It's associated with Passover. So we talked about this very significant Jewish festival where the unleavened matzah, the balls in this case, represent the haste with which the Israelites left Egypt during the Exodus because they had no time for their bread to rise. So that's the biblical link of this particular food, this matzah, and the matzah balls are eaten during Passover for that reason, because that is when they are commemorating that Exodus. And so it's a traditional food. It symbolizes the resilience and the history of the Jewish people. Can be eaten anytime, but it is especially eaten at Passover, but it's often eaten at Hanukkah as well. I have many Jewish friends who eat it at Hanukkah, but it's mostly eaten at Passover, and it would be obviously kosher as well, and that's a whole other conversation. So that would be matzo ball soup would be the first dish I would mention. The second one I would mention would be potato latkes. So latkes are just crispy potato pancakes. They're delicious, can also be eaten anytime. They're traditionally served with applesauce or a vegan sour cream, and typically, I would imagine you would find lots of recipes made with eggs, but we don't use eggs in our recipe. And I do have a recipe also in my Hanukkah bundle for latkes. And if you have the vegan table, I included that recipe. My God, how many years ago? 10 years ago when I wrote that particular book. So you can find the latkes in that book if you already have it. Now, whereas you can say matzah is a quintessential Jewish food, potato pancakes are not exclusively Jewish, but they've become associated and well known as a traditional food during the Jewish festival of Hanukkah. Now, this holiday commemorates the rededication of the Second Temple of Jerusalem. This is when the Maccabees, you would have heard about the Maccabean revolt, they were revolting against the ruler in that region, that time. His name was Antiochus, and he was trying to impose Hellenistic Greek culture and religion on the Jewish population. And so the Maccabees, they reclaimed Jerusalem in this revolt, and they reclaimed the Second Temple. This is in 164 BC. And so upon reclaiming the temple and reconsecrating it, they found a small jar of consecrated oil, enough for one day to light the menorah. This was the seven-branched candelabrum, right, in the temple. So they found enough oil to light that menorah for one day. However, miraculously, the oil lasted for 8 days, allowing enough time to prepare a new supply of consecrated oil. And so this miraculous event is at the heart of the Hanukkah story. So to commemorate the miracle of the oil Hanukkah, also known as the Festival of Lights, is celebrated for 8 nights. Each night, one additional candle is lit on the menorah until all 8 candles are lit by the 8th night. I think there's also like a central candle, like a helper candle that you light, by which you light the other candles. And so that's the idea. And additionally, there are traditional Hanukkah foods such as latkes, potato pancakes. And the reason they are a traditional food during this time is because they are fried. They are fried in oil. So they symbolize the oil that lasted 8 days, right? So Hanukkah is a time for joy. It's a time for gratitude. It's a time to celebrate religious freedom, and latkes are part of that. Now, there's another dish that is significant to Hanukkah, also having to do with oil. I can tell you that while I have recipes for latkes, I do not have recipes for the next one because I refuse to deep fry anything, even though I am happy to eat deep fried things sometimes. And these are jelly donuts. Sufganiyah is the plural, sufganiyot is the singular. So these are round jelly donuts. I grew up with these in New Jersey. I loved these jelly donuts. And they're eaten around the world on the Jewish festival of Hanukkah, especially in Israel. And I was going to keep desserts separate, but as we just discussed Hanukkah, I wanted it to have that continuity. So I'm going to pop it in here. So the donuts deep fried, also related to the oil. That's why it's a Hanukkah food. It's injected with jam. It's topped with powdered sugar. It originated in Europe in the 16th century. But by the 19th century, it was known as the Berliner in Germany. So again, obviously donuts are not just specifically a Jewish food. However, they are really tied to this community in Eastern Europe, and it very much is a Hanukkah food. Now, moving on to kugel, which okay, so kugel wouldn't necessarily fall under the dessert category. It can be savory, it can be sweet. It's a topic for much debate because some people make their kugel sweet, some people make it savory. I make mine on the sweeter side. When I say that, I mean I'm using cinnamon and raisins. There's different ways to make kugel, and just people all have their own preferences. So it's funny because even though mine is sweeter, you would still serve it with all of the mains. Like you wouldn't serve it as a dessert. And again, I have a kugel in the vegan table, but also in my Hanukkah and my Passover bundles. It's in both. So the best way to think of a kugel is to think of it as a noodle or a potato casserole. So think of it as a casserole or a pudding for my UK listeners. And you can easily make this with plant-based ingredients. Typically, you would have eggs. Typically, you would use egg noodles if you're using noodles, but you don't have to. You can use, and again, if you're not making this for Passover, you can use any kind of noodles, but you can also use, there are kosher noodles at Passover time that you can use for the kugel. You can also use mashed potatoes. So there's lots of different varieties of this. Think of it essentially as a way to combine a starch and a fat. Okay, so it can be simple with just like salt and pepper, but typically you would have like fried onions, like in the savory version, you'd have raisins and cinnamon in the sweeter version, which is mine, which is delicious. I really like kugel, but I think because it has a texture that is very, soft, it's noodles. Not everyone loves it, but I really like kugel. Now, the word kugel comes from the German word for ball because originally they were more like dumplings, but today it's definitely much more of a casserole. So then you have another dish that is typically eaten on the Jewish Sabbath, which again is observed from Friday evening to Saturday evening. And this is challah. It's a special braided bread, which is so delicious. And this is definitely a food that has crossed over, I think, into the general culinary cuisine tradition, the general public. But it is customary for Jewish families to share a special meal on the Sabbath, the Shabbat, if you honor that. And challah is often served then. However, it's also associated with holidays like Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year, and Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement. So on Rosh Hashanah, it's common to have a round challah to symbolize the cyclical nature of the year and the continuity of life, hence the new year, right? And it's also served at other festive meals on other Jewish holidays. It has strong ties to Ashkenazi Jewish cuisine, but variations can be found in other Jewish communities, each with its own cultural references each with its own regional influences, but it's eaten at many Jewish festivals and holidays. It's in my Hanukkah bundle. And I do have a separate video and recipe at joyfulvegan.com where I show you how to make. I have a video where you can just make the most gloriously gorgeous, fluffy, beautiful vegan challah. So you can go to joyfulvegan.com and find it there as well. So you can find it in the bundle for the Hanukkah bundle, but you can also find it separate if you just want the challah recipe. I love challah. Who does not? Who doesn't? Who doesn't? And typically it would be made with chicken's eggs, but we don't make it with chicken's eggs. And typically we'd be brushed with a chicken egg wash, but we don't do that either. So you can go check out the recipe to see how I do it. Okay, moving on to a traditional Jewish pastry that's beloved in Jewish cuisine, also delicious, but I don't think a lot of people make it, is rugelach. So I have a rugelach in my Joy of Vegan Baking. It is a pastry. It's a confection. I would call it a confection. It is a pastry, but it's a really rich dough and it's often made with cream cheese in the dough. So, an enriched dough means that you're adding fat to a dough. So if I'm making, I don't know, pizza, that's not really an enriched dough. But if I'm adding non-dairy butter, I'm adding non-dairy milk, I'm adding, egg replacements, that kind of thing, that's an enriched dough. And so rogalach, the dough, is made with cream cheese. So it's really rich, really tender, really delicious. And it contains usually some kind of fruit preserves. You can nuts, you can use cinnamon, sugar, chocolate. It's rolled into a log and then it's cut into individual portions. And so it's just absolutely rich and delicious. So the fillings that I tend to use are more of the jams, but you can also make rogaluk with chocolate chips. It really depends on, again, the region, your family traditions, the rogaluk that you grew up with or knew and loved. It is a popular treat, not only during Jewish holidays like Hanukkah, but also year round. I had many bakeries near us in Livingston that served rogaluk, and before I was vegan, I used to eat it quite often. So you can find a recipe for a vegan version in my Hanukkah bundle. So definitely a very kind of quintessential Jewish food. It's derived from the Yiddish word meaning royal, so you can kind of get a sense of how sweet and rich the pastry is. And it would have originated in the Jewish communities of Poland. So very much a Jewish food. Moving on to another favorite treat that's also in the joy of vegan baking, and that is babka, specifically chocolate babka. So babka is a sweet twisted bread or cake. It's a yeasted cake. Think of it like that. It's a bread or a yeasted cake that's traditionally associated with Ashkenazi Jewish cuisine. The exact origins of babka are a bit hard to pinpoint. The pastry has evolved over time and it's associated with multiple Eastern European and Jewish culinary traditions. But as such, it tends to be connected with the Ashkenazi. The word babka is derived from the Polish and Yiddish term for grandmother, so it reflects this real nostalgic and traditional nature of this dessert. So the babka I'm most familiar with would be more Ashkenazi. It is typically made from a sweet yeasted dough. It's rolled out. It's filled with ingredients like chocolate or cinnamon, nuts, fruit, and then you twist it into this distinctive swirl pattern. It's often baked as a loaf or in a round shape. I would often put it in kind of like a bundt cake pan, and it's baked and it's so delicious. If you watch the Great British Baking Show, the Great British Bake Off, they did do a babka, I think, last season. It's really fun. It's a really fun, very, I don't know, for me, it feels very, I think of the winter holidays. I make babka every winter, and it really is very much this, just kind of comfort food. So that would be babka. Then we have borscht. So I mentioned borscht earlier. This is a soup that's traditionally associated with Eastern European cuisine in countries like Russia, Ukraine, Poland, but it's often linked to Ashkenazi cuisine because Ashkenazi Jews have a historical presence in Eastern Europe. So that's where borscht is a well-known and beloved dish, and it would have been taken up by the Jewish communities. So borscht itself is not inherently Jewish, but it's a soup that's been adapted and enjoyed by various communities, various Jewish and non-Jewish communities. It's one of my favorite soups of all time. It is beets. So if you like beets, it is just the most gorgeous soup. And dill. Like you just put as much dill in this. It's such a warming, beautiful, gorgeous soup and really beautiful to make for the holidays. So you can, make it and change it depending on, again, whether it has Ashkenazi or Sephardic roots. But it is absolutely delicious, or non-Ashkenazi or Sephardic roots, because it has Eastern European roots through and through. But it's really wonderful. I highly recommend it. And I do have a recipe for it somewhere. I think if you search on the website, you'll find it. So moving on to another type of pastry is a knish. So knishes are a type of filled pastry that originated in Eastern Europe, particularly among Jewish communities. And the history of knishes is closely tied to the Ashkenazi Jewish culinary tradition. So the word knish itself derives from the Yiddish word meaning dumpling. So they are basically savory pastries made by wrapping a filling, commonly mashed potatoes, probably meat sometimes, I don't know, you can use vegan meat, cheese in a dough. That's the idea. And then it's baked or fried. So the exact origin of knishes is not precisely documented, but they have historical ties to Eastern European Jewish communities. They've been a staple in Jewish cuisine for centuries. So the knish is probably something that evolved as a convenient portable food. I think of, pasties like in the UK. It's a very common human thing to kind of put all of your things, your entire meal into one little purse, so one little edible purse, and be able to transport it very easily. And speaking of transporting this food, as Jewish immigrants brought their culinary traditions to various parts of the world, including the United States, knishes became a popular snack and street food in Jewish delis, bakeries. Again, totally grew up with knishes in New York and New Jersey. And knishes are very much associated with New York City. So if you are in that region, you are very familiar with them. They have certainly gained popularity among a broader population, and so you can easily make them vegan, and I'm sure there are vegan versions in delis in New York for sure, and in vegan restaurants and bakeries, I'm sure you can find them. But if you're making them from scratch, you can easily make them with just vegetables and plant-based ingredients. And then finally, we're going to talk about cabbage rolls, because cabbage rolls are part of Jewish cuisine, particularly again in Ashkenazi Jewish traditions. They're prepared by filling, blanched cabbage leaves with a mixture of, let's say, vegan meat, rice, and then simmering them in a tomato-based sauce. So cabbage rolls are enjoyed on Jewish holidays and family gatherings, can be eaten year-round. It is definitely something that is part of Eastern European cuisine. It's not unique to Jewish cuisine, the cabbage rolls. And in fact, for our Christmas this year, I have a very, very good friend who's Macedonian, and it's because cabbage rolls, again, would be very much an Eastern European cuisine. And my friend being from the Balkans, her mother, it's one of the things she's bringing with her to our Christmas dinner, because her mother has a recipe for it that is Macedonian, and it's very nostalgic and it's very personal. So we're going to have cabbage rolls as part of our Christmas this year. Our Christmas theme this year, if you might remember, I've done a Christmas theme every year. Last year it was Swedish, which was really fun, honoring one of my friends whose background is Swedish. The year before that was Tudor. It was really just more for fun, to really kind of focus on some Tudor recipes that I could veganize, like Tudor, like Tudor, like the Tudors in England. And this year, it just felt right to focus just on memories and nostalgia. And so I've invited my friends who are coming to Christmas to celebrate with us, the same friends who usually come every year, to bring dishes, stories, music, traditions, anything that is really personal for them, anything that reflects kind of personal memories and nostalgia. And so that's why for this Christmas, my friend Anna is bringing the cabbage rolls, sarma, they'd be called in Macedonian. And this would be very much an Eastern European dish, certainly also embraced by and made part of Jewish cuisine, but not unique to it. So a lot of those are going to be familiar to you, because when Ashkenazi Jews especially migrated to the Americas, particularly to the United States, seeking economic opportunities, escaping persecution in Europe, they brought with them their cuisine, just like when Italians were migrating from southern Italy, they brought with them their traditions. And now we have a very unique Italian American cuisine, which does not necessarily reflect exactly, the regions from which the immigrants came. And same with the Jewish cuisine, we have something that we can call Jewish American cuisine. So let's talk about a little bit about that. Now, Jews traveled around the United States, right? They didn't stay in just one place, although we really do tend to associate Jewish communities with New York and New Jersey and the East Coast for sure, 100%. However, they did travel around. And so as they traveled around, they brought their traditions with them to different parts. And then those traditions were kind of, modified based on where they were in the United States. So you have this amalgamation, you have this unique cuisine called Jewish American cuisine. It's a hybrid of basically traditional Jewish cuisine, Eastern European cuisine, with a Jewish infusion and American infusion as well, because of with the topography, the climate, the available foods, the socioeconomic situation, again, whatever it was. Now, first of all, you have something very much Jewish American, and that would be bagels and cream cheese. Now, obviously, bagels and lox would be another one, but I'm not here to talk about lox. Let's talk about bagels. So, bagels have Eastern European Jewish origins. But the combination of bagels with cream cheese, that's an iconic Jewish American dish, particularly associated with New York. And bagels are classic, right? But it wasn't a given. It's particularly a coming together of two distinct cuisines that birthed another. Now, I will say it's very interesting because when we moved out to California, the things that you could say are different in terms of food, and I will celebrate California cuisine all the way to the bank. But the things that you would compare when you are in California, because there's nothing like California produce, there's just nothing like it, the freshness, etc. But of course, the things that we would think about comparing what we have access to here in California versus New York and New Jersey would be pizza, for sure, because again, Italian immigrants settled mostly in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, that area. And bagels, of course. Of course, bagels. Okay, and I will tell you this, that because there's always different articles and opinions about who has the best this or who has the best that, who has the best pizza, where can you find the best bagels? And there's a bagel maker here in Berkeley. I think they started in Oakland, but they also just opened a shop in Berkeley called Boychik Bagels, and they have been voted the best bagels in the United States. So even outside of New York. Now there could be this controversy around that and everyone has their own opinion, but they are amazing bagels. So if you're out in the Bay Area, look for Boychek. And if you come out and you're visiting me, I'll get you some Boychek. I also make bagels. I do make bagels from scratch. I do have bagels in one of my bundles at joyfulvegan.com. But oh man, there's just nothing like good old-fashioned Jewish bagels. That's what they are. And then cream cheese, of course. And so there's lots of wonderful plant-based cream cheeses out there you can enjoy as well. Another example of maybe a Jewish American cuisine food that I mentioned earlier is challah, but challah French toast. It's kind of become a very trendy thing across the United States in different parts. You might not see it where you are, but I think you're seeing it more and more. So you're seeing challah, I think, on menus more. You're seeing it certainly infuse the general culinary population more than, say, another cuisine's bread. I mean, it's a very, very quintessential Jewish bread that I think you're seeing more widespread. Now, of course, the idea behind French toast is not unique to the United States. It's not American per se. Other cultures have versions of it. The idea is to use up bread you have instead of wasting it. So pain perdu in France and eggy bread in England. That's the same tradition. French toast in the United States, but challah French toast, I think, is a nod to American breakfast traditions. And then you have this fusion which marries Jewish and American flavors. Same thing with matzo ball soup. You've got variations depending on where you are in the United States. And because Jewish cuisine represents resiliency and adaptability, you do have perfectly acceptable variations of matzo ball soup, for instance. It's perfectly acceptable to use vegetable stock instead of chicken stock for matzo ball soup if you're vegetarian or vegan. Same thing with adding vegetables outside of what the traditional matzo ball soup would be, noodles. I think you can see a bit of the American influence, certainly in some of the traditional Eastern European Jewish cuisine coming over to the United States. You can see some of a healthier influence in some ways, in some ways, because you see a really unhealthy example of this in Italian cuisine that came over from southern Italy, which doesn't in any way resemble what the American version is. Just very different, much more cheese, much more meat than would have been in the original Southern Italian food dish, etc. So same thing with rogalach. I mean, once you have, like chocolate chips in your rogalach, it's very much American, outside of just the fruit preserve. So you just see variations on these traditions. But there are other examples, and a lot of them have to do with animal meat. So I'm I'm not going to get into that too much, but like we can't talk about Jewish American cuisine without talking about Jewish delis. We just can't. And something I grew up with, which was pastrami and rye. Like we just can't, we cannot talk about Jewish American cuisine without talking about that. So delicatessens, they originated in Germany. It's a German word. It comes from the word delicat, which means delicate or fine, and essen, which means food, right? And so delicatessens were present in Germany. In fact, the original delicatessen was founded in 1700 in Munich, in Germany. And they served as establishments that offered a variety of imported specialty foods. And then these delicatessens spread to the United States in the mid 19th century, and European immigrants brought them with them, especially Ashkenazi Jews. And they popularized the delicatessen in the United States beginning in the late 19th century. Their commitment to keeping kosher, guided by kashrut, the Jewish dietary laws, led to the emergence of delis as central places offering kosher or kosher-style food options, right, for those who were observing them. Traditional Jewish dishes like pastrami, corned beef, matzo ball soup, bagels became popular staples in delis and contributed to the identity of what we could now call Jewish deli cuisine. And as Jewish immigrants settled in these urban areas, delis flourished in neighborhoods with significant Jewish populations, again, especially in New York, in the urban areas, and served as gathering places where people could connect with their cultural heritage. Now, these days, I could walk into a Jewish deli, and there is one down in the uptown area of Oakland, and I could find something. I could find something. I could definitely find pickled foods. I could find pickles. The best pickles I've ever had are there. And I'd be able to get something made with just plant foods. But obviously, these delis, definitely have a lot of meat. And so you had these Jewish entrepreneurs who were entering the food industry. They were establishing delis. It provided economic stability. And they also became symbols of Jewish identity in the US. And certainly over time, these menus have adapted to cater to American taste while preserving some of the essence of traditional Jewish cuisine. So I've spent a lot of time talking about the difference between Ashkenazic and Sephardic food, and I don't want to give the impression that this distinction is rigid. They are generalizations, and individual foods and practices and recipes vary widely within each group. And as Jewish communities have interacted and migrated and moved around, there's obviously been a blending and a sharing of culinary traditions between the two. So I don't want to make it sound like it's rigid, but I just wanted to kind of give a better understanding of the difference. Now, when it comes to religion, both communities have the same religious beliefs. There are some variations when it comes to some of the culinary traditions, having again to do with topography, socioeconomics, climate, wherever they were, right? So we talked about this on the Passover episode. Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jews both avoid leavened foods during Passover, but there are some variations. The former, the Ashkenazic, avoid additional foods collectively known as kitiniot. That's legumes, lentils, buckwheat, caraway seeds, cardamom, corn, millet, mustard, peanuts, peas, poppy seeds. Like they go on and on, mostly seeds and legumes and beans. Traditionally, Sephardic Jews eat these foods during Passover. Again, it all comes down to the individual, to how observant they are. And just if you're making something for a Passover meal and you're bringing it to a Passover meal, you're just going to want to check with your host first to see if they avoid kitiniot. Another example of some culinary differences between the two groups is haroset, which is another example of a dish associated with Passover. And we talked about it in the Passover episode, but essentially, there's just a difference in the recipe. So there is more of the Ashkenazic style, which is more like a chutney with apples, and that's mine with apples, walnuts, spices, cinnamon, that kind of thing. It's a bit more chunky, it's a bit more like chutney. And I do have a recipe in the Passover bundle for that and in the vegan table. And then you have more of the paste like haroset, the Sephardic style, which is more like using dates and figs and almonds, and it's more like a paste. So while these are two very different ways of making haroset, the idea is the haroset represents the mortar used by Jewish slaves in ancient Egypt, right? And that's what it represents. So whether you're doing the chutney style or the paste style, it doesn't matter. The idea is that they both represent the same. But that's just a couple differences between the two groups where there are common threads. And then there's similarities and differences when it comes to the Jewish dietary laws. We talked already about the kitanyot. That's going to be one difference. And so kashrut, which means proper, it means correct, refers to this system of Jewish dietary laws. And it's often, so kosher is usually the term used to describe the food or the products or the practices that comply with the laws. So think about kosher as the food and kashrut as the concept of the laws. And so observance of kashrut, it's an integral part of Jewish religious life for those who follow traditional dietary laws, and it plays a significant role in maintaining this distinctive Jewish identity and connection to religious tradition. So these dietary laws are a set of rules or a set of guidelines that dictate which foods are kosher, permissible, and which ones are not. And these laws are outlined in the Torah, specifically in the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And to be clear, if you are Jewish and you're observing kashrut, then you're both, whether, whatever community you're part of, Ashkenazi, Sephardic, what have you, there's similarities with all of them. There's a couple differences, the kitanyot that I mentioned, but there's also differences whether you're Orthodox or conservative or reform or secular. So there is a range, and the degree to which these laws are followed really differ significantly among Jewish individuals, Jewish communities, etc. So there's a huge range. The Jewish community is hugely diverse. There is no single approach to kosher observance that applies to all Jews, but there is still the thread, there is still the connection. And we're going to talk about specifically the animal related aspects of kashrut in a different episode, because when you look at the key principles of kashrut, basically you have avoiding the consumption of certain animals, not an issue for us who are vegan and vegetarian. You have a particular slaughtering method. So animals considered kosher must be slaughtered in accordance with specific rituals and under the supervision of a trained individual. That's what we're going to talk about. That's what we talked about in the Isaac Bashevis Singer episodes. Again, not a non-issue for vegans, but the reason I'm going to do an episode on that is because there's a lot of misconceptions about it. Another aspect is the separation of meat and dairy. Again, not an issue for vegans. This is why it's so very much accessible and easy to be vegan and follow kashrut, to be kosher, because these are all non-issues. And then you have the blessings and preparations, which are part of it as well. So essentially, we're going to be talking about the detail regarding the slaughter of animals under these laws in a different episode. But I hope you enjoyed this episode. There's a lot to say, and I hope I've at least given you something to walk away with, not only in terms of the specific dishes that you can say that's Jewish, that's not Jewish, but really walking away with the idea that, like all cuisines, Jewish cuisine plays a huge role in preserving cultural heritage, passing that heritage down through generations, particularly for people who've been dispersed across the world and across the centuries. I hope you have the idea of the shared rituals, certainly during holidays like Passover and Hanukkah, where foods become emblematic of the shared cultural experience. Obviously, families have specific recipes, like all of us, whatever culture we're raised in, that make those variations unique to our own connections, our own families. And certainly, food has such an extraordinary power to transcend cultural boundaries. It brings people together in a shared experience. I have friends who do honor the Sabbath, and they say it's like Thanksgiving every week, right? The idea that there is an intentional coming together around the food, whatever you believe. The table is a place where we share and we connect and where stories are are told and friendships are forged and bridges are built. And that's the power of food. And so I hope that's a takeaway for you wherever you are, whatever you believe, whatever your background, whatever your history, whatever your religious beliefs. And that goes obviously also for embracing eating plants and not animals. We have such an opportunity to reflect our values in our behavior and to not only reflect our culture and our family history, but also to reflect our compassion for other animals. And so may that be so for you. I hope for you, I hope for all of us that our culinary explorations be guided by the principles of compassion and understanding and a shared responsibility to create a more harmonious and interconnected global community. And may it be so. For the animals, this is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. Thanks for listening.